Hi everybody, it's Miss Mellors here. I hope you enjoyed the first part of chapter 4 that Mr. Broomfield read yesterday, and I've got the next part here. Suddenly there was a noise like thunder, and before he knew where he was, a whole mountain of things began to fall on him. It was as if a whole sky had fallen in. Everything went quiet, and he lay where he was for a few minutes with his eyes tightly shut, hardly daring to breathe. From a long way away he could hear voices, and once or twice it sounded as if somebody was banging on a window. He opened one eye carefully and was surprised to find the light had come on again. At last, sheepishly, he pushed the hood off his duffel coat and up over his head. They hadn't gone out at all. His hood must have fallen over his head when he bent down inside the shop to pick up his case. Paddington sat up and looked around to see where he was. He felt much better now. Somewhat to his astonishment, he found he was sitting in a small room, in the middle of which was a great pile of tins and basins and bowls. I wonder where he is. He rubbed his eyes and stared around at the sight. Behind him there was a wall with a door in it, and in front of him there was a large window. On the other side of the window there was a large crowd of people pushing one another and pointing in his direction. Paddington decided with pleasure that they must be pointing at him. He stood up with difficulty, because it was hard standing up straight on top of a lot of tins, and pulled the pom-pom on his hat as high as it would go. A cheer went up from the crowd. Paddington gave a bow. He waved several times and then started to examine the damage all around him. Oh dear, I bet he's made a real mess. For a moment he wasn't quite sure where he was, and then it came to him. Instead of going out into the street, he must have opened a door leading to one of the shop windows at the front of the shop. Paddington was an observant bear, and since he had arrived in London, he'd noticed lots of these shop windows. They were very interesting. They always had so many things inside of them to look at. Once he'd seen a man working in one, piling tin cans and boxes up on top of one another to make a pyramid. He remembered deciding at the time that it was a nice job to have. He looked around thoughtfully. "Oh dear," he said. "To the world in general, I'm in trouble again." If he knocked all these things down, as he supposed he must have done, someone was going to be very cross. In fact, lots of people were going to be cross. People weren't very good at having things explained to them, and it was going to be difficult explaining how his duffel coat hood had fallen over his head. He bent down and began to pick up the things. There were some glass shelves lying on the floor where they had fallen. It was getting warm inside the window, so he took off his duffel coat and hung it carefully on a nail. Then he picked up a glass shelf and tried balancing it on top of some tins. I don't think that's a very good idea, do you? It seemed to work, so he put some more tins and a washing up bowl on top of that. It was rather wobbly, but he stood back and examined it. Yes, it looked quite nice. There was an encouraging round of applause from outside. Paddington waved a paw at the crowd and picked up another shelf. Inside the shop, Mrs. Brown was having an earnest conversation with the store detective. "You say you left him here, madam?" the detective was saying. "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "He was feeling ill, and I told him not to go away. His name is Paddington." Paddington, the store detective wrote down in his notebook. "And what sort of bear is he?" "Oh, he's sort of golden," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing a blue duffel coat and carrying a suitcase." "And his ears are black," said Judy. "You can't mistake him." "Black ears," the detective repeated, licking his pencil. "I don't expect that'll help much," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing his beret." The detective cupped his hand over his ear. "His what?" he shouted. There was really a terrible noise coming from somewhere. It seemed to be getting worse every minute. Every now and then there was a round of applause, and several times he distinctly heard the sound of people cheering. "His beret!" shouted Mrs. Brown in return. "A green woolen one that came down over his ears with a pom-pom." The detective shut his notebook with a snap. The noise outside was definitely getting worse. "Pardon me," he said sternly. "There's something strange going on that needs investigating." Mrs. Brown and Judy exchanged glances and looked at each other. The same thought was running through both of their minds. They both said, "Paddington!" and rushed off after the detective. Mrs. Brown clung to the detective's coat, and Judy clung to Mrs. Brown's as they forced their way through the crowd. On the pavement, just as they reached a window, a tremendous cheer went up. "Oh, I might have known," said Mrs. Brown. "Oh, Paddington!" exclaimed Judy. Paddington had just reached the top of his pyramid. At last, it started off to be a pyramid, but it wasn't really. It wasn't any particular shape at all, and it was very rickety. I think this is going to end in a disaster, don't you? Having placed the last tin on the top, Paddington was in trouble. He wanted to get down, but he couldn't. He reached out a paw at the mountain, and the mountain began to wobble. Paddington clung helplessly to the tins, swaying to and fro, watched by a fascinated audience. And then, without any warning, the whole lot collapsed again, only this time Paddington was on top and not underneath. A groan of disappointment went up from the crowd. "That's the best thing I've seen in years," said a man in the crowd to Mrs. Brown. "Blessed if I know how they think these things up." "Will he do it again, Mummy?" asked another small boy. "I don't think so, dear," said his mother. "I think he'll be finished for the day." She pointed to the window where the detective was removing a sorry-looking Paddington. Mrs. Brown hurried back to the entrance, followed by Judy. Inside the shop, the detective looked at Paddington and then at his notebook. Blue duffel coat, tick. Green woolen beret, tick. He pulled the beret off. Black ears, tick. "I know who you are," he said grimly. "You are Paddington." Paddington nearly fell backwards with astonishment. "However did you know that?" he said. "I'm a detective," said the man. "It's my job to know these things. We're always on the look for our criminals." "But I'm not a criminal," said Paddington. "I'm a bear. Besides, I was only tidying up the window." "Tidying up the window?" the detective spluttered. "I don't know what Mrs. Perkins will have to say. She only dressed that this morning." Paddington looked around uneasily. He could see Mrs. Brown and Judy hurrying towards him. In fact, there were several people coming his way, including an important-looking man in a black coat and striped trousers. They all reached him at the same time and all began talking together. Paddington sat down on his case and watched them. There were times like this when it was much better to keep quiet than it was. In the end, it was the most important-looking man who won the conversation because he had the loudest voice and kept on talking when everyone else had finished. To Paddington's surprise, he reached down, took hold of Paddington's paw and started to shake it so hard that he thought it was going to drop off. "Delighted to know you, Bear," he boomed. "Delighted to know you, and congratulations." "That's all right," said Paddington, doubtfully. He didn't know why, but the man seemed very pleased. He turned to Mrs. Brown. "You say his name is Paddington?" "That's right," said Mrs. Brown, "and I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" The man looked at Mrs. Brown in amazement. "Did you say harm? My dear lady, through the action of this bear, we've had the biggest crowd in years. Our telephone hasn't stopped ringing." He waved towards the entrance of the store. "And still they're coming in." He placed his hand on Paddington's head. "Barkridge's," he said. "Barkridge's is grateful." He waved another hand for silence. "We would like to show you our gratitude and say thank you. If there is anything, would you like anything from store?" Paddington's eyes gleamed. He knew what he wanted, but he'd seen it on the way up to the outfitting department. It had been standing all by itself on a counter in the food store, the biggest one he had ever seen, almost as big as himself. "Please," he said, "I'd like one of those jars of marmalade, the big ones." If the manager of Barkridge's felt surprised, he didn't show it. He stood responsibly to one side, by the entrance to the lift. "Marmalade it shall be," he said, pressing the button. "I think," said Paddington, "if you don't mind, I'd rather use the stairs." Right, that is the end of Chapter 4 for today, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you listen to Chapter 5 tomorrow. See you all soon.